It is midnight in the Southern Ocean, May 1916. A tiny 22-foot wooden lifeboat is being tossed like a toy in the worst stretch of water on Earth. Inside, 6 men are huddled together. They're covered in saltwater boils, they're dehydrated, and they're freezing to death. At the tiller sits their leader, Sir Ernest Shackleton. He has not slept in days. Through the screaming wind and the darkness, Shackleton looks up. He sees a line of white light across the sky. He yells to his men, "It's clearing, boys! The storm is breaking!" But a moment later, the blood freezes in his veins. It wasn't a clearing in the clouds. It was the white foam of a rogue wave, so massive it stretched from horizon to horizon. He screamed, "Hold on! For God's sake, hold on!" The wave crashed down, burying the boat underwater. By all laws of physics, they should have drowned in that moment. By all laws of probability, every single man on this expedition should have died months ago. They were stranded at the bottom of the world. They had no ship, they had no radio, they had no food. And yet, this is not a story of tragedy. It is the greatest survival story in human history. This is the story of the Endurance. 28 men vanished into the ice, and through impossible leadership and sheer grit, they tried to cheat death. Before we begin this journey into the ice, I have a request. History is usually filled with wars and crimes, but sometimes it shows us what humans are capable of when they refuse to give up. If you want to support this kind of storytelling, please hit the subscribe button and click the like button on this video. It helps these stories survive in the algorithm. To understand the miracle, we have to go back to the beginning. 1914, London. The world is on the brink of World War I, but Ernest Shackleton is looking south. He plans the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The goal is to cross the Antarctic continent on foot. Legend says he placed an ad in the newspaper that read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Whether the ad was real or not, the spirit was. Thousands applied. Shackleton picked 27 men, scientists, sailors, photographers, and even a stowaway. They sailed on a ship called the Endurance. She was a beauty, built of thick Norwegian timber, designed to smash through the polar pack ice. They thought the ship was invincible, but as they entered the Weddell Sea, the temperature plummeted. The water turned to slush and then to stone. The ice wasn't just floating, it was moving, it was breathing. And one morning, the ice stopped moving. The Endurance was stuck. The trap had snapped shut. January 1915. The Weddell Sea. The Endurance was within sight of the Antarctic continent. The men could see the land, but the wind changed, and the temperature dropped rapidly. The ocean around them didn't just freeze, it compressed. The ice floes packed together, trapping the ship in a frozen grip. For days, the crew tried to cut their way out. They used picks, saws, and the ship's engine at full power, but the ice was too thick. Shackleton realized the truth. They weren't going anywhere. The ship was now a winter station. They prepared for the long polar night. For months, they lived in relative comfort aboard the ship. They played soccer on the ice. They put on plays. They waited for spring, believing that when the sun returned, the ice would melt and free them. But when spring finally arrived in October, it brought a new horror. The ice didn't melt, it began to move. Millions of tons of ice were shifting due to ocean currents, and the Endurance was directly in the middle of the pressure. The sound was the worst part. The men described it as the sound of a heavy train crossing a bridge, mixed with the screaming of dying animals. Thick wooden beams, built to withstand anything, snapped like matchsticks. The deck buckled, the masts whipped back and forth. The ice was literally crushing the ship to death.
On October 27, 1915, Shackleton looked at his broken ship. The hull was split open. Water was pouring in. He gave the order, "Abandon ship." The men unloaded their supplies, their sleeping bags, and 3 small lifeboats onto the ice floe. A few weeks later, they stood on the ice and watched the final act. The Endurance lifted her stern into the air and slid beneath the dark water. Shackleton turned to his men. He didn't show fear. He didn't show despair. He simply said, "She's gone, boys." They were now 28 men standing on a floating sheet of ice, thousands of miles from civilization, with no ship, no radio, and limited food. The expedition was over. The battle for survival had begun.
They called it Ocean Camp. It was a fragile village of tents pitched on a drifting slab of ice less than 10 feet thick. Beneath them was 2 miles of black ocean. For 5 months, this was their home. The cold was brutal, often dropping to -20 degrees. But the cold wasn't the biggest enemy. The enemy was the mind. Shackleton knew that in these conditions, despair would kill his men faster than frostbite. He became obsessed with morale. He insisted on strict routines. Meals were served at exact times. He forced the men to socialize, to play cards, and to sing songs in the evenings. When the photographer Frank Hurley lost his mittens, Shackleton gave him his own. When Hurley tried to refuse, Shackleton threatened to throw the mittens into the sea. He was watching them like a hawk, looking for any sign of a mental break. But as the weeks turned into months, the situation grew desperate. The food supplies dwindled. They hunted seals and penguins, eating the meat and burning the blubber for fuel. Then came the hardest day of all. The dogs, who had been their faithful companions, required too much food. Shackleton gave the order. The dogs and the ship's beloved cat, Mrs. Chippy, had to be shot. The men wept as they pulled the triggers. They ate the dog meat to survive. It was a grim turning point. They were no longer explorers, they were predators. By April 1916, the solid ice pack began to disintegrate. The ocean swell was lifting and cracking their floating home. One night, a crack opened up right beneath a tent. A man fell into the freezing water in his sleeping bag. Shackleton pulled him out seconds before the 2 halves of the ice smashed back together. On April 9th, the end of the ice came. The floe shattered into small fragments. The open ocean was right in front of them. Shackleton yelled the order, "Launch the boats!" They dragged the 3 small lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, into the dark, churning water. They were leaving the stability of the ice for the chaos of the sea. Their destination was Elephant Island, a desolate rock 100 miles away. But between them and the island lay a nightmare of freezing spray, killer whales, and storms. The journey to Elephant Island was a descent into hell. For 7 days and nights, the 3 open boats battled the Southern Ocean. The men were constantly soaked by freezing spray. The seawater froze on their clothes, turning them into suits of armor that rubbed their skin raw. They couldn't sleep. If they stopped bailing water, the boats would sink. If they stopped moving, they would freeze to death. Thirst became torture. Their fresh water supplies were gone, and their tongues swelled so much they could barely speak. One night, the currents separated the boats. In the darkness, the navigator, Frank Worsley, had to steer by the feel of the wind on his cheek because he couldn't see his compass. But finally, the gray shape of a mountain appeared through the mist. Elephant Island. They crashed through the surf and collapsed onto the rocky beach. Some men were so dehydrated they crawled to a glacier and drank until they vomited. It was the first time they had stood on solid land in 497 days. They laughed, they hugged, they let the pebbles run through their fingers. But as the adrenaline faded, the grim reality set in.
Elephant Island was a desolate rock. It was far outside any shipping lanes. No search party would ever look there. Winter was approaching again. The seals and penguins would leave soon. They had exchanged a slow death on the ice for a slow death on a rock. Shackleton looked at his men. Some were on the verge of insanity. Others had severe frostbite. He knew they couldn't survive the winter here. He gathered them around and made a terrifying announcement. He wasn't going to wait to die. He was going to take the largest boat, the James C. Caird, and sail it across the most dangerous ocean on the planet to get help. It was a suicide mission. The destination was South Georgia Island, a tiny speck in the ocean, 800 miles away. To get there, they had to cross the Drake Passage in winter, a 22-foot boat against 60-foot waves. Before we follow Shackleton into the storm, a quick reminder. If you're finding this story incredible, please subscribe to the channel. We tell the stories of human endurance that define who we are. Hit the like button so we can keep bringing history to life. Shackleton chose 5 men to go with him. The carpenter, Chippy McNeish, raised the sides of the lifeboat with scraps of wood and canvas to keep the water out. They loaded it with rocks for ballast. On Easter Monday, 1916, they pushed the James Caird into the surf. The 22 men left behind on the beach cheered them on, trying to hide their tears. They watched until the little white sail disappeared into the gray horizon. The odds of them ever seeing Shackleton again were close to 0.
The Drake Passage is known as the Furious 50s. It is a stretch of ocean where there is no land to stop the wind. The waves can grow to the height of a 7-story building. This was the battlefield for the James Caird. Inside the boat, life was a miserable cycle of freezing and bailing. The 6 men were divided into 2 watches. While 3 men steered and bailed water, the other 3 tried to sleep in the bottom of the boat. They crawled into wet reindeer hide sleeping bags that were slowly rotting. The smell was unbearable. The wet fur shed hair that got into their mouths and noses, choking them as they tried to breathe. Their legs were white and swollen from the salt water. Their hands were covered in frostbite blisters. The needle in the haystack. The lives of all 28 men now depended on one man, Frank Worsley, the navigator. His task was impossible. He had to guide a tossing cork across 800 miles of stormy ocean to hit a tiny island. If he was off by just a few degrees, they would miss South Georgia and be swept out into the vast Atlantic to die of thirst. For 16 days, the sky was a gray ceiling. Worsley had to navigate by guessing the speed of the waves. He only saw the sun 4 times during the entire voyage. He would stand up, hugging the mast with one arm, trying to hold his sextant steady while the boat pitched violently. The ice. Then the temperature dropped. Spray began to freeze on the boat's deck. The weight of the ice threatened to capsize them. In the pitch black of night, the men had to crawl out onto the slippery, frozen deck. With axes in their frozen hands, they chipped away at the ice while the boat lurched beneath them. One slip meant instant death in the black water. The rogue wave. On the 7th day, the midnight giant struck. This was the moment Shackleton thought was the end. The rogue wave crashed over them. The boat was instantly filled half full of water. They were sinking. Shackleton screamed, "Bail! Bail for your lives!" They used pots, sleeping bags, even their hats to throw the water out. They worked with the energy of dying men. Slowly, the boat rose back up. They had survived by seconds. The Devil's Doorstep. On May 8th, through a break in the mist, they saw black cliffs. South Georgia. They had done the impossible. They had crossed the ocean. But the ocean wasn't done with them yet. Just as they approached the land, a hurricane struck.
It was the worst storm recorded in the area for decades. They couldn't land in the storm without being smashed against the rocks. For 9 agonizing hours, they had to ride out the hurricane just offshore. They could hear the waves pounding against the cliffs in the dark, knowing that if the anchor chain broke, they were dead. On the morning of May 10th, the wind died down. They steered the battered boat into a small inlet called King Haakon Bay. They stumbled onto the beach and drank from a fresh stream. They were alive, but they were on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station and rescue was on the north coast. Between them and salvation lay the interior of South Georgia, a maze of glaciers and mountains that no human had ever crossed.
May 19th, 1916, South Georgia Island. The 6 men on the beach were broken. 2 of them, Chippy McNeish and John Vincent, were unable to walk. The journey in the boat had crippled them. Shackleton realized they couldn't sail the boat around the island. It was too damaged. There was only one option left. They had to walk. They had to cross the interior of South Georgia. It was a nightmare landscape of jagged peaks and glaciers that no human being had ever crossed before. They had no map. They had no tent. They had no climbing gear. Shackleton chose his 2 strongest men, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean. They left the others under the overturned lifeboat and prepared to march into the unknown. The screws. They were sailors, not mountaineers. Their boots were smooth leather, useless on ice. So, in a stroke of desperate ingenuity, they took screws from the lifeboat's carpentry box and drove them into the soles of their boots. These makeshift crampons were the only thing keeping them from slipping to their deaths. The climb. They marched by moonlight. For hours they climbed, only to find their path blocked by sheer cliffs. They had to retrace their steps and start again. By midnight, they were at the top of a razor-sharp ridge. Fog was rolling in below them. The temperature was plummeting. They were trapped. If they stayed on the ridge, they would freeze to death in their wet clothes. If they climbed down slowly, the cold would catch them. The leap of faith. Shackleton looked down into the black abyss of the fog. He couldn't see the bottom. He turned to the others and said, "We have to slide." It was insanity. Sliding down an unknown glacier in the dark. A single rock or a crevasse would mean instant death. But they had no choice. They sat on coiled ropes like sleds. They locked their arms around each other, and they pushed off. They plummeted into the darkness. The wind screamed in their ears. They fell for thousands of feet in seconds. Then the slope leveled out. They slowed down and came to a stop in a bank of soft snow. They stood up and shook hands. They had descended 3,000 feet in 3 minutes. They were alive. The 4th man. They kept walking. They knew if they stopped to sleep, they would never wake up. Years later, all 3 men would confess something strange about that march. They all felt that there were not 3 of them, but 4. A 4th presence seemed to be walking beside them, guiding them through the whiteout. Shackleton later wrote, "I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. 7 a.m., May 20th. They heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the cracking of ice. It was a steam whistle. It was the 7 o'clock whistle at the Stromness whaling station, calling men to work. It was the first sound of civilization they had heard in nearly 2 years. They looked at each other, their faces black with blubber smoke, their hair matted and wild. They began to run. The meeting. They walked into the manager's office. The manager looked up. He saw 3 terrifying figures standing in the doorway. They smelled of death and rotting seal meat. The manager stood up and asked,
"Who the hell are you?" The man in the center stepped forward. "My name is Shackleton," he said. The manager, a tough Norwegian whaler, turned away and wept.
May 1916, South Georgia. Shackleton, Crean, and Worsley were safe. They had warm beds, food, and clothes. But Shackleton could not rest. He paced the floor at night. He knew that every hour he wasted, the 22 men left behind on Elephant Island were closer to death. They were living under 2 overturned boats, eating seaweed and boiled sealskin. They had no idea if Shackleton was alive or dead. The wall of ice rescue should have been easy now, but the Antarctic wasn't done fighting. Shackleton borrowed a ship to go back. The pack ice blocked him. He borrowed a second ship. The ice blocked him again. He tried a third time. The engine broke down. For 4 agonizing months, Shackleton stared at the horizon, helpless. He wrote to his wife, "I have done it to get them out, and I will not let the ice beat me." The Yelcho. Finally, the Chilean government gave him an old, rusty steam tug called the Yelcho. It had no radio and no heater. On August 30, 1916, the Yelcho approached Elephant Island. The fog lifted. Through his binoculars, Shackleton saw the beach. He saw tiny figures running out from under the overturned boats. They were waving wildly. Shackleton began to count. 1, 2, 3. The suspense was unbearable. If even one man had died of starvation, the mission was a failure. The miracle. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Worsley, tears streaming down his face. He shouted the words that would become history. "They are all there, Skipper! They are all there!" Shackleton took a boat to the beach. He didn't even step ashore. He just yelled, "Get in the boat! Throw your gear! Get in!" He was terrified the ice would close in again. Within an hour, all 22 men were on board. As they sailed away, they ate the first bread they had tasted in nearly a year. They looked back at the desolate island that had been their prison, unable to believe they were leaving. The legacy. They returned to a world on fire. While they were fighting to save 28 lives in the ice, millions of young men were being slaughtered in the trenches of World War I. In the grand scale of the war, the survival of a few explorers seemed insignificant. But over time, the story of the Endurance became a legend. It is not a story about conquering nature. They failed to cross the continent. They lost their ship. They came back with nothing. But they won the only victory that mattered. They defeated despair. Shackleton didn't lose a single man. The end of the boss. Ernest Shackleton never settled down. The ice called him back. He died of a heart attack in 1922 on his ship right off the coast of South Georgia. He is buried there today among the whalers and the seals. On his grave, the headstone reads a quote from a poet, "I hold that a man should strive to the uttermost for his life's set prize." Case status closed. This concludes the file on the Endurance. In a world that often feels dark, remember, 28 men survived the impossible because they refused to leave each other behind. Now, I need your input for the next investigation. We can go back to the darkness of true crime or explore a mystery. Vote in the comments. A. The Dyatlov Pass incident, the unexplainable deaths in the mountains. B. Unit 731, the full uncensored breakdown of the medical crimes, revisiting the dark. C. The Somerton Man, the spy mystery that was never solved. And finally, this channel lives because of you. Please share this video. Send it to a friend who needs a reminder that the human spirit is tough. Subscribe and stay vigilant. Thanks for watching.